All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. This is like being back on radio. I'm Lake Sagaris, and in one of my former lives, I was a radio journalist. So I'm trying to call on all that experience and imagine who is listening, which is, of course, rather difficult. And this was a difficult presentation to prepare because I wasn't sure who was going to come. So I'm very interested in your questions. I've tried to give kind of a good basis and a taste of the different things that are relevant to what I'm saying in this presentation, but certainly if anyone has any questions or comments or observations from your own experience, I'll be very, very happy to hear them. And I will go rather quickly over some things and try to spend a bit more time on things that I think may be less familiar to you all. So welcome, and let's get started. This presentation reflects a lot of work that I've done, really systematizing what has become the emerging science of planning for cycle inclusion. And one of the things that's begun to intrigue me most recently is whether some of these lessons that I'm beginning to derive from my studies of cycle inclusion are relevant to public transport, sustainable transport generally, and particularly to bus rapid transit, since we have had such a hard time positioning it and winning people's hearts and minds. And I think there are some clues to why that has happened in these experiences. So I'm going to talk, because I wasn't sure about everyone who's participating, I am going to talk a bit about some of the concepts and methods that I've been using from the social sciences to try and look into transport more deeply. I'm going to use a specific case of cycle inclusion planning and experience here in Santiago, which produced some very rapid change, not something you expect in urban systems, but it was. And then a few final reflections on what I think this could say about or could suggest for future work on BRT in the practical world, and also for research that would complement that. So, some concepts and methods from the social sciences. My area, or one of my main areas of expertise, is planning and participation. And I have to say that what I'm observing, and I'm of course going to be quite Chilean focused here, although I do travel a lot, and I can't say I've seen a whole lot of variety in this. But what little citizen participation there is in bus system development is usually occurring mostly at the project level, and it's often too little, too late. And the quality is often, can even be counterproductive. That is, produce hostility to the bus system rather than affection for it. And I think we really don't pay enough attention to participation at the planning level. That is, the process that can define the consensuses that form the foundation of the public transport system we end up with. And a colleague of mine from the Netherlands produced this very interesting contrast between projects and processes. Both involve planning, but they're quite different. And to date, and particularly here in Chile, I've noticed this a lot lately, most of the planning goes on with projects. And of course, urban planning is more than just the accumulation of a lot of different projects. So I will also say here that a lot of what I'm observing or proposing or starting to use as new techniques or alternative techniques, I don't see them as substituting for what we're doing, but rather as complements. So when I say that process planning is important, I'm not saying that project planning is no good and we should throw it out. That would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What I'm really saying is that we want to have both kinds of planning and participation at both levels to get the most out of our processes. So planning tends to be very focused on a specific project with a linear set of steps, and it's really trying to get to a known result within the shortest possible time frame. It also, because of this, it often attempts to control people and is much more concerned with shutting them up than getting them involved and listening to what they have to say. It tends to be quite inflexible, and it also tends to highlight solely technical expertise and to ignore or at least not include the fact that there's an awful lot of experiential knowledge that can contribute significantly to the success of a planning proposal. So it also tends not to produce a lot of learning, and the risk is that it's obsolete by the time it's completed, which we see more and more often with our planning, given how much life has sped up with the new technologies and so on. So process planning, it seeks the best solution. So it's often a bit open-ended, although there usually is a time frame. Nonetheless, it's not infinite, but results can be uncertain. We're going to define this problem, but we're going to take some time defining the problem. It's not the same to discuss, if we define the problem as, shall we put this garbage dump in this neighborhood or over here? That's quite different from saying, how will we deal with solid waste in the city so that we can get much more out of them and really reduce the external costs of them. Process planning does try to involve people, and the original concepts often evolve as more and more people and perspectives get involved. It also tends to be a circular, or what we call in the social sciences, an iterative process. It's like a conversation. I say, well, I think we should do this, or I think this is the problem. And then you say, well, but what about this? I think this is a part of the problem, and maybe it's more serious than what you're saying. And so we go back and forth, and we build through that back and forth a new consensus. And that consensus in planning theory, Patsy Healy calls it strategic conviction. And it's when enough people, when a critical mass of people in the planning system, and that includes citizens, are really convinced that this new technology, hybrid technology, human, machine, the BRT, is really the best way to go to structure our cities and so on. And people begin to automatically start working on that. Is that better, John? I hope so. Thanks for reminding me of that. Okay, so a lot of planning today is also quite linear. We look for a single cause, a single effect. We want to focus on a single problem, a single solution. We want this amount of information in, and we want this amount of result out. Again, I emphasize here, I'm not saying that's bad. That works for a lot of different problems, usually relatively simple problems. Our challenge, however, is that many of our problems in the city and with planning and with transport systems are actually complex systems. So this planning that's focused solely on identifying and responding to trends often ends up reinforcing them, even the negative, harmful ones. So the classic example in our field is when we project that car use and car ownership is on the rise, and that's going to continue rising. And instead of really thinking about what to do about this to change this reality, we start building more and more and more highways. And then, of course, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we end up with a lot of congestion and a lot of problems. So in today's complex world, however, what we're really looking at are multiple causes, and above all, these really complex interactions between all these causes and these often unexpected results. This is known as the butterfly effect, when one small miscalculation or oversight leads to a huge series of problems. A typical one in our field is thinking that it will be faster to plan if we leave citizens out of the equation. And then what we find is they don't like our proposal, and we have this huge protest movement mushrooming on Gran Avenida in Santiago, and all the storekeepers and the tree huggers and everyone else is all out, and boom, we can't put our BRT express route through there. And we fail not once, but twice, and with the more times we fail, of course, the higher the risk is. We'll keep failing. So we're also finding more and more that what really works is a solution that addresses many problems or many issues. So we want transport solutions now, not just to move a person from their origin to their destination, but we want transport solutions for trip chaining. But even more complex than that, increasingly, we need transport systems that will make people healthier, that encourages them to walk, that encourages them to cycle, that ensures there's less traffic on local streets, so there are more relationships, more social security on our streets as well. Quite often in developing countries, we want transport solutions that are going to improve social justice, that are going to include and involve people. And so we also find with the demands or the challenges of climate change, loss of biodiversity, all these issues that seem to be coming together like a perfect storm to seriously menace humanity in our century. More and more, they're not accepting this in-out approach, but rather, how do we create a virtuous cycle that will make the most of resources and minimize waste all the way along the chain of decision-making, implementation, and actions. So this requires a new kind of planning. So probably any of you who have been reading about complexity or curious about how it could apply to our world and our planning world will recognize some of this, but for many people it may be new, or parts of it may be new. So I wanted to give a bit of a genealogy of the complexity thinking. This is a very broad body of knowledge. There is no one single complexity theory, but there are a number of key concepts that I apply here. And it really started in 1994 with a rather excellent book that translated a series of findings and new ways of thinking based on those findings from Prigogine and physics, Maturana and Varela in biology and ecology, and Mandelbrot in the study of weather. This is a wonderful map of all the thinking about complexity and what it's derived into, and it's related to computers and theories about knowledge. And in the social, which is what I've circled here, there's complex systems theory, complex adaptive systems, there's social complexity, and then down in the corner, there's this little area that's developed quite a lot in the past decade on how we apply these kinds of ideas to cities. Really fascinating. So a key book in this process is this one by Gunderson and Holling, which looks at the bridge between new discoveries in ecology and the social. And then some of the other books here that have certainly influenced my thinking and my methods as I approach city systems as complex are these ones. Portugali's work on the city and cognition, David Byrne, who's really an amazing, amazing thinker and has done a lot of work on complex causality as opposed to simple causality. And then, of course, for my own field, Judith Innes and David Boer, who have really applied this to planning systems. And within this, some of you, especially anyone working in corporations or organizations or organizational theory, may be familiar with Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer and their U theory of learning. And of course, I'm not going to go into this in great detail here, but what I did want to emphasize is that, again, when it comes to planning, this gives us a tool for not just sort of problem in, solution out, in which we're not really going to addressing the underlying problems, but this gives us a tool for sort of going deep into not only how we see the problem, but how we structure the process for resolving it, how we actually go into it and reframe it, and then basically regeneration at the point where there's a new consensus. And here what's interesting, and this is very true of really successful participatory processes, is they're very slow to start. But once everyone's agreed, everything's really fast, right? So we'll talk about that a bit more as we go along here. So I'm also working from an urban planning perspective, and because I'm trained as a planner in the North in University of Toronto, but I've lived in Chile for the past 30 years, all my adult life. I'm very aware that what planning is in one language is not the same as in another. So here, we don't really have much planning per se. There's engineering, which of course does a part of city development and design. There's architecture and design. Both of these very concerned with technologies, with things, with the placement of things, the organization of things, the flows that make things work. And then sociology as a social science. But of course, this is all taking place in a very complex and constantly changing world. So it's very dynamic and interdisciplinary. And so where I'm coming from is this planning, which is sort of at the intersection of these three key fields. Of course, in the English-speaking world, it's mostly associated with geography, human geography, because of issues of space and scale that are integral to understanding territory. And planning as a discipline, of course, separated from the School of Sociology in Chicago more than 100 years ago. So it actually has advanced into a lot of new terrain since then, and particularly after the new wave of democratization in Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand after World War II. So there's a lot about collaboration in there because that's what happens when you have to do things democratically. So in terms of applications in urban planning, another thing that's important to some of the things I'm going to look at here is understanding positionality, because many of us come from a very traditional view where the researcher or the thinker is located outside, third person examination, and they sort of look down godlike on the reality. But what we've realized in the social sciences and have begun to explore a lot more, particularly given a lot of the colossal errors and conflicts and debates that have arisen in anthropology or psychology or planning itself, is that there is also an insider perspective. And actually, there's not just one, there are many. And that there's also the perspective of people who are sort of close to the issue, but not right in between it, in the middle of it. And then there are partners, perspectives from different cultures and different countries. In the case of the work I do, people from India, North America, Latin America, etc. So trying to bring together as many of these positionalities and perspectives to really get the whole picture is part of the, I hate to use these long words, I can hardly pronounce them in Spanish or in English, epistemology and ontology of this kind of research. So this will be very familiar to some people, especially from the social sciences, but maybe a little less familiar to people from other disciplines. And this involves diverse methods. I'm not going to go through each of them, but these are certainly a part of the ways that I've got at some of the things I'll talk about in the next section on cycling. And so we're also trying to integrate this perspective, taking into consideration these different positionalities with political knowledge, how to move power, and citizens' experiential knowledge. Because even the most brilliant ideas or theories or proposals for urban change will go nowhere if they don't achieve the enough backing to really move political and public opinion. So again, here we have the different elements in this little complex world. And within that, my perspective is the theory and practice of collaborative planning, which is a very effective way of looking at these different factors without totally getting lost or confused in the process. So just a couple of terms and ideas from complexity. One of the reasons why it's interesting for this work is that it is really essentially a theory of change. And it's a theory of change that looks at incremental, lurching, and paradigmatic change. That's in Thomas Kuhn's sense, for those who like the history of science. And so it's multi-scalar, it's interdisciplinary, and it's also very clear that rather than seeking a single universal law that can be applied effectively everywhere, what it does attempt to do is identify certain rules that can be tested in local contexts. So there's also this concept that every system and the subsystems in that system are constantly going through this process of exploitation. Things begin to consolidate, they become more rigid, and then they hit a crisis and they release. But they don't just collapse or die. What actually happens is they reorganize. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. The other concept that's important to this kind of study is this idea of nested scales. We often forget about scales when we only look at the city from the perspective of society overall or a specific technical background. So these are examples from Gunder and Hollingsson on sort of nested scales, how the needle on a tree is related to the crown, which is related to a patch of trees, a stand, a forest, to a whole landscape. And then how a breeze or thunderstorms can move fire and lead to a budworm, and other elements can be affected. And similarly, in society, we see the small group is involved. And also, particularly here, what I want to emphasize is we think of the bottom up and we think of the top down, which is sort of the micro scale and the macro scale, but we forget about the meso scale, the middle scale, the middle actors. And actually, the middle actors are really important, because what happens is that scale either connects or disconnects, separates or potentiates, empowers the different interactions possible from a national policy to a local policy, etc. So in terms of these studies on cities and the dynamics of cities, what we have is this nested scale composed of the individual in a group, groups in the wider community, the community in the world, but also the world in the community. And there isn't this long linear ladder between one and the next. We're all nested in. We're all deeply, deeply embedded. I'm a local citizen and a national citizen at the same time. I'm an individual and I'm a member of different collectives locally and globally at the same time. So that's this idea of nested scales, and it actually explains a great deal, as we'll see a little further on. So another concept from complexity that I've used here is the idea that while there may be millions of factors driving a system and giving it its characteristics and its movements and its dynamics, there may be 2 or 3 simple but crucial interactions that are driving the whole system. And this was illustrated beautifully by Craig Reynolds' experience with Boyd's in the 1970s. He was a scientist and an animator, and what he did was he used 3 very simple rules: separation, alignment, and cohesion. And with that, he could simulate all the complex patterns of flocking and soaring and plunging and diving and dispersing and coming together of a flock of birds. So in the city, this plays out a lot in the interplay between things that are complicated and things that are complex. And here again, I am not saying that one is valid and the other's not, because you can use a closed system analysis for many, many problems and issues and get excellent results. But sometimes you don't. Sometimes you get totally unexpected results and you don't know what to do with them. So that's where adding this complexity view is interesting. So in the complicated world, we have a closed system that's relatively predictable. If I go through step 1 to 599, I will get to 600. We also have this contrast with complexity with the open system. From the different subsystems, a new and unpredictable reality can emerge. Democracy, for example, where did that come from? Out of feudalism and everything else, how on earth did we get democracy? It would have seemed impossible at the time, and yet there it came. The central metaphor of complicated or closed system perspectives tends to be the machine. And if you look at the language that we use, it's all about machinery breaking down or working or chugging along, or the levers. I use this language too. But in complexity, it helps to expand that metaphor of the machine and complement it with a lot of the new ideas and metaphors from ecology, and particularly ideas about the need for diversity, for different actors, living and non-living, for their niches, etc. And we're also talking moving between the complicated idea that there are separate scales, but they're very separate, and there's a very linear, lengthy connection with them. And this idea that there's only the micro and the macro, to the nested scales. So how would we apply this in a realistic way in the city? Well, there's a very nice, handy example, and that is highways, right? We have this idea, highways and congestion. We have this idea that the city is going to collapse, that congestion is going to swallow us up, that it's going to be a total disaster if we don't build a highway or whatever. But rather, we have these new experiences like this very well-known one from Seoul in Korea, where they closed down a highway and they turned it into a park. And what we really got was not the machine collapse, but the reorganization of the complex system, and it was very effective. So just to look at cycle inclusion for a moment, this is a term that comes from the Netherlands. It involves an approach to planning for bicycling and tricycling that really involves users and needs in the planning, organization, and functioning of the city and all its complementary systems. In our applications here in Latin America or elsewhere in the world, obviously we have to think about the fact that we are similar to the Netherlands in some ways, but we're very different in others. So we always have to adapt these terms and these ideas and these approaches. There is no perfect practice or perfect measure that can just be taken and applied anywhere. So we also have this very interesting but very complex context, which is the street. Because the street is actually not like a machine. We can read it like a machine for some purposes, and that will work, like a network, etc. But for other purposes, we need to understand the street as a kind of watershed, a street shed that communicates and connects or isolates and segregates. So it's tremendously powerful. And we've known this since Appleyard's beautiful, beautiful studies of livable streets in San Francisco in the 70s and early 80s, where he discovered that the more traffic, the fewer people you know, and the fewer relations, the more unsafe your street becomes, and the more damaged mental and physical health. Well, this is really important in a world that's suffering from very serious deficits of public space. These are just some figures that'll probably be familiar to most of you, showing just how inadequate the amount of public space or shared space or green space per capita is in many of our cities. And at the same time, contrasting that with the huge amount of the city that is becoming dedicated to streets. So the street as a contested space that's not only for flows but also for other purposes is very important. They're a major cultural space, particularly in developing countries. And look at the United States, where they've been trying to bring back festivals and street fairs to breathe new life into abandoned city centers. Well, we have very vital city centers throughout our cities, thanks to these kinds of street fairs, to the social spaces that surround them and surround things like these metro stations. These are also really important. Streets are also really important working capital for people who are very vulnerable. So obviously they're going to be contested heavily when we try to say, oh no, the street is only for cars, which is very much the planning model that we find ourselves with. And altogether, these different activities and elements create livability, right? Our streets, how multifaceted and how inclusive in many dimensions our streets are, relates directly to the quality of life, to security, to road safety, to a whole series of factors that are extremely important from the perspective of people. And of course, the exercise of citizenship and political rights is also very important, and streets are crucial to that. So again, a street is no minor thing, but it's actually a very major part of urban society. So coming back to cycle inclusion and this idea of integrating cycling, not treating it as a little add-on, but as an essential part of any sustainable transport solution, I'll just quickly summarize the Santiago experience, which was that thanks to a very effective advertising campaign, it was so popular, it's still on YouTube. You can look it up, Cómprate un auto perico, which in English would be get yourself a car buddy, which shows a very famous actor pedaling through traffic, being almost run over and threatened and laughed at by everyone and their dog, and finally gets to his girlfriend's house with his bouquet of flowers, and all she says to him is, get yourself a car buddy. So this was very much the image of cycling right up until 2007. But after we held this major participatory process, a very empowered, collaborative participatory process, the amount of funding for cycling facilities went up, the master plan was updated and became a matter of widespread consensus. The number of kilometers of cycling facilities quadrupled. The quality is still pretty bad, but it is also improving as a result of this process. And the number of cyclists on the main routes has been climbing. The modal share has gone from 3% in 2006 to 7% 2012. Women have gone from being a very small minority to being roughly a third of cyclists. And it was a presidential priority, not just in the first Bachelet government, but it also crossed political lines, which people who've been in Chile for any amount of time know how unusual that is. And of course, we expect great things to go on. So this participatory process, very briefly, was collaborative. It was led by a citizens organization, by the Metro Santiago regional government, by a group of cycling organizations, 6 cycling organizations, and who came together with the idea that we had to stop fighting amongst ourselves, we had to stop eating each other alive, that we needed a lot of different organizations, and we needed to build bridges. And it started to have a great deal of effect. We also were able to bring in Dutch expertise, and not only Dutch expertise, but Dutch expertise as it was being chewed over and applied and tested and experimented with in Brazil, in India, in several African countries, and several Latin American countries. So it was an extremely rich knowledge base on which to base our experiment. What I want to emphasize, I have an article about this if anyone wants more details, but what I want to emphasize is that unlike most participatory processes, which are typically measured by the number of people who come together, probably once, this was a series of small working groups and a plenary that never had more than 80 to 100 people involved. The actual list of people involved was 1,500. And I actually had the chance to go through these lists and analyze them when I did my doctoral work. But what I want to emphasize is that the best work and the best quality participation for change, for creating that strategic conviction more favorable to sustainable transport, takes place in essentially small groups. And they have to meet over a period of time. In this case, it was a 3-year process, with new information coming in from the Dutch and a lot of experience in the field as well, doing audits, cycle rides, walks, conversations. So just a few of the lessons and some reflections on the questions they raise for me with regard to BRT and public transit, but particularly a really excellent approach to public transit like BRT. And so what I'm looking at here, and this is where all the first part about complexity comes in, are what were the key intersections and the key interactions that produce change. In the planning system, Well, the first thing is that we think that the political process or the planning system is very linear, that citizens or someone with good ideas talks either to technical staff and politicians, they convince them with the strength of their arguments and how rational and good they are, and those people go ahead and change laws and implement new ideas. Well, as anyone who's tried to do things that way knows, that doesn't work, right? So the reason it doesn't work is because our governance systems are extremely complex. In fact, if you look at this little model of who was involved in cycle planning during our cycle process, what's amazing is that actually the Ministry of Transport has very little to do with cycling or anything. The Ministry of Public Works is building highways and rural cycleways. The Housing Ministry was rejecting standards and so on. And it was really the municipalities who were leading. So how do we read this kind of thing in a way, these different scales, to understand how to work them effectively with what are usually our very limited resources? So it's really useful to look at this from the perspective of scale, geography, and nested scales, realizing these scales don't exist apart from each other, but they're intimately connected. And we can actually translate this map of the scales into the different people. This is our policy environment and the different niches within the policy environment at the national, meso or regional scale, and at the local and municipal scale. And what you can see here is how the different groups moved different parts of the political system without ever going to lobby Congress or lobby a ministry or whatever. And you can actually assign numbers to this, and this is where you can see how or why such very small groups were able to move such large numbers of people. That is, to change cycling's image from being a poor man's ride to being the sexiest thing on wheels, which is basically the way it stands today. And so you can see very small groups, but connecting in the end to hundreds and indeed thousands of people, and particularly civil society organizations. So from the perspective of the planning system, we went from this linear structure where we really see ourselves canceled out in a lot of cases by competing interests, to a situation where basically with the round table and the working groups, it became very transparent. If a politician promised something and then went and did something else, we all heard about it. We were very connected. So it really made planning much more transparent and democratic, and so on. So what this also highlights is that civil society, that is organized citizens groups of many different kinds, is really important. And that also makes the kind of participation we offer citizens very important. So that if we're only offering paternalism, which is indeed the case with most kinds of participation today, then we're giving information, and at the most we ask a few questions, and then we go away as policymakers or planners and do whatever we want. Well, that's a very top-down approach, and it creates, in the best of cases, very little. It's sterile. It controls, it imposes, and it often creates conflict. Because, of course, you get the bottom-up response to this kind of imposition, and so you end up with conflict. And conflict, while it's not ideal, at least it opens doors and it creates opportunity if we know how to make the most of those opportunities. So here we have these two faces of the same coin, conflict and paternalism. A lot of discrimination, a lot of power behind the scenes, and not much transparency. But what we managed to do with the cycle participation in the round table process was to really create this new collaborative co-production process through deliberation, the diversity of those deliberating. It's no good only bringing planners together, or only bringing bus operators together, or only bringing operators together. We need that diversity of opinions to enrich the data available for the discussion. But we also need interdependence. We have to need each other, something that ties us together so that when I, as a citizen, and I'm absolutely furious with this very patronizing political authority, I still stay at the table because I have the opportunity and I need to convince them. So this has implications for the development of autonomous citizenship. And I'll go through this very quickly, but it is important, particularly in developing countries and newly democratizing contexts. We need to move beyond clientship, which basically supports the political powers or the political positions that be because they're our friends, because they're papito, because they're going to look after us if we do, to much more autonomous political agency that's going to be more favorable to innovation. Again, just emphasizing that we need to understand that we are really an ecology of actors, that person who thinks differently from me and has a different strategy from me, that doesn't mean I have to be the same. And I don't need to demand that they have to think the same as I am. But we can work together on certain key agreements and positions, such as we all need sustainable transport. And one of the really interesting things, and I have traveled a lot and done a lot of field work in diverse cities around the world, India, Europe, Africa, Latin America, North America, is that really in the case of cycle inclusion, at least, that there is no country that's achieved steady progress without a strong, relevant group of citizen organizations. And if you think about BRT, you think, do we have that in our cities? Some cities have users organizations. That's very exceptional. Some cities have walkers organizations. Most cities these days have cycling organizations. But we're really behind on our public transport solutions. And we also, this is sort of the latest of what I've been looking at, is that in this ecology, we need different kinds of organizations. One of the ways to measure the differences is by looking at how complex they are or how sophisticated they are. But complexity between simple to complex seemed a more neutral terminology because they're all important. Single issue, single tactic, which would be like the critical mass organizations that were born in San Francisco and New York, or the Furiosos Ciclistas here, where, you go to the monthly cycle ride, you're a part of the movement, and it's fantastic. It's very easy to get in. It's also very easy to get out. But they play a big role in positioning these kinds of issues. We don't have an equivalent for bus rapid transit. Then there's the multi-issue or multi-tactic ones, and they're very important from the perspective of who they bring into the issue. Because when you get a women's cycling group or a heritage cycling group, then you're connecting cycling with heritage, or cycling with gender, or in the case of the Bicicultura Festival, with culture and mapping and so on. That means you're no longer preaching to the converted. You're reaching out to a much broader, more diverse, and therefore more representative part of society. And then you get the occasional organization like Living City, which was very important in Chile for the cycling process that I've just described, cycling is just one thing in everything else it does on sort of citizen-led planning. So the richer our ecology of actors, the more effective we become in positioning our issues, getting them onto political agendas, getting them discussed around kitchen tables, which is really where public opinion's decided. So just briefly, to look also at the dynamics for change in the city system, because we've just gone through a lot of things related to the planning system and the political system. So for cycling, what we find, and there are a lot of debates about this, is infrastructure better, or is training better? Is it education or motivation, or what is it? And so we get these either or dichotomies. when in fact what my research demonstrates really strongly is that it's the interaction between key measures that are appropriate to the local context that really make the difference. And there is also an economic sphere that's really important, whether it be having the right bicycles for women or the right bicycles and accessories for carrying cargo, or whether it be having the right consultants to do good cycle designs, etc. There are really important interactions between these three spheres. So what's important about this is that what it suggests is it's not that you have to do a million things to make your city more cycling inclusive. It's not that you have to go down this checklist of dozens and dozens of infrastructure and intersection and road speeds and other measures. What you really need to do is get the key ones that are right for your context. So, for example, probably in a small or medium-sized city, the urban measures, a few key urban measures, speeds, traffic calming in residential neighborhoods, and so on, will be very important, but behavioral change, really significantly reducing speeds, will be more crucial. Whereas in a large city with a lot of highways or very rapid traffic and so on, we're really looking more at infrastructure and segregation and so on and so forth. So I started to wonder, could these levers for change be relevant for other transport forms? And certainly if we look at automobility, which is the way the social sciences characterize our car-centered planning, city, social, economic systems, what you find is, yes, automobility, the car, is an industry, it's a financial product, but it's also a culture, it's a way of life, it's a kind of globalization, it's a powerful cultural symbol, and it is the result of 50 years or even more of really intense propaganda. So there's nothing, or advertising, if you want to call it advertising, there's nothing natural or inevitable about it. So yeah, in the case of automobility, we can see these three areas or levers interacting incredibly effectively, which of course what that means is that the system has accumulated, and has become extremely rigid and is very much threatened by that rigidity because it's becoming increasingly dysfunctional, congestion being an example of that. So what about BRT, huh? In these spheres, we really don't see a lot of thinking along these lines. We see a few urban measures that are really important, some segregated busways, but not very many. I can't think of any whole city networks and really well integrated networks where trains and undergrounds and cycling and cycle taxis, etc., are all connected and articulated by a bus rapid transit system, which would be my idea of sort of an ideal sustainable transport system. In the behavioral sphere, at the most we see efforts to improve customer information, surveys, etc., but we don't see any encouragement to civil society. Cycling's had a lot of funding for civil society development, in some places more than others, and in many places it's developed in spite of lack of encouragement, and it's been very rebellious and fierce and so on. The Netherlands, that was certainly the case in the 1970s, which is where their model came from. And in the case of BRT for the economy, one of the things that really struck me taking a ride along the Metropolitano in Lima was, wow, there are kilometers of areas along that BRT, and all you see are these little workshops all oriented to selling and repairing cars. What are we going to replace that with as we build cities to have more efficient, more sustainable transport systems? So we're kind of a bit short on these measures, and it probably does help us to understand what is lacking for us to get ahead and to really position where we want to go. So there are lots of possibilities and potential. There's, well, street jugglers and so on. There's street vendors selling juice. These are socially inclusive measures that need to become a part of our transport planning if, as we are so often challenged to do, we are going to respond to social imperatives as well as just sort of the technical imperatives of moving people around. So to summarize and leave some time for questions and conversation, I think there are lessons for BRT. We need to jumpstart some kind of civil society involvement in our efforts. And one logical way, which we are experimenting with in Santiago this year, is partnering with cyclists and other sustainable transport modes. We need to build really powerful alliances favoring all sustainable transport. And in that sense, our bus operators have just been doing a campaign for exclusive lanes for buses. And we're saying we need to change the name of that and call them inclusive lanes. And we really need to think about how we include all our sustainable transport partners and stop just battling for ourselves and sort of pushing our way, elbowing others who should be our friends and allies out of the way. And we do need to build, and this is a big challenge, robust civil society ecologies that are friendly to our aims, that understand them, and influence, deeply influence, the way we implement our transport projects. So just one final reflection on the research implications of this is, if we want good practice, we need good theory. You can't separate the two effectively. And I think part of our problem is in transport planning, we spend an awful lot of time doing and trying to find quick fixes to problems rather than really taking a step back and thinking, wait a minute, where are these problems coming from? How can we address them from underneath, from the depths? So in that sense, I think we need to know a lot more about social sustainability. We haven't really talked about it or researched it much in the academia. Everyone knows what environmental sustainability is, economic sustainability, but the social is not so clear. How does health come into this? How do politics come into it? We need to also complement our simple causality models with complex causality. And that's not an easy thing to understand. We need to work with it. We need to develop it. We need to create tools based on our conclusions about complex causality. And we really need to take civil society organization much more seriously. So that's it in a nutshell. Thank you very much. I hope it's been useful to you all. And I look forward to your questions and comments. I gather you can just type these in. I have the question section open here, and I'm looking at it anxiously for some feedback from some of you. Okay, here comes someone, I think. Oh, you're talking though. I can't hear. Can you hear anyone? Is this talking? BRTCOE?
No, it's yours.
Ah, okay, that's me. No questions? Where are you from? What do you do? Tell me something about yourselves, at least. I have lots of questions for you.
Yeah, actually. Well, thank you for your nice presentation. I have one comments. I think that one important thing that you tell is that the distribution of the decision of the power of the decision-making process, that it is not equally distributed in the different actors, the general population, institutions, or governmental authorities. So, do you have any experience of how to handle the conflict of interest in the planning process, considering this difference in the distribution of the power of the decision?
Well, there's a lot of factors involved in that, and of course that's part of what I've been talking about. But what I would say is the short answer to that is that timing is very important. That the longer a situation goes on that's unbearable for some of the actors, the greater the energy that builds up, and so the greater the conflict. If you build consensus, if you build a process that decides, okay, we don't agree on this, but we do agree on this and this and this, then you can create a dynamic of conversation, of distribution of power and decision making, and you can avoid a lot of conflicts. It does require very serious political will and different kinds of will. This is why empowerment is such a relevant word, because whether we like it or not, some actors in the system have a lot more power than other actors. And if we want to create a collaborative process, a more horizontal process, a more inclusive and effective process, then some of us with more power have to give that up and have to be willing to sacrifice some of our own interests or our own insistence in favor of including others. That's much easier in collective settings than one-on-one. And you can do it a lot with the rules of engagement in a well-designed participatory process. But I must say that improvisation in this is really bad. I'm not sure you need a doctorate in participation to do it well, but you certainly need a really solid background, a lot of experience, and a very strong theory that informs the way you behave, or you will make a lot of really disastrous mistakes. Okay, so now we do have some questions here. Okay, so we have an engineer working on her master's in sustainable transportation. Nice to have you on board, Angela Nunez. Very good. Yes, we have a question from John Shaw. Has there been direct opposition to BRT from established interests in Chile? I would say there's been incredible opposition, and it's not very direct. A lot of the way things work in Chile is very between the lines, but the way you see it very clearly is in the power elite. For example, we have a very small political, religious, economic, social elite that still controls a good part of the country, as the UN has documented with its studies. And so, for example, subsidies for public transport are extremely controversial, and they almost killed the Transantiago bus system in 2007, 2008, 2009. There has been much more subsidy poured into highway projects. Even concessions that are supposed to be private money have taken $500 million, $600 million. No debate there. No debate at all. So we end up with this very vicious circle where the idea of dedicating more space to BRT in the city, having city roads more fairly divided so that bus users have the appropriate space and we don't have buses with 120 people stopped by cars with 10 people. Those kinds of debates have become very, very difficult. And the reason is that people who travel by bus are stigmatized and considered the way cyclists used to be, old-fashioned, poor, kind of marginal, not so important in the scheme of things, etc. And what we haven't got is that critical mass that we need of people who see that, hey, yeah, if we have a really good bus system articulated mainly by BRT, then as a cyclist, that benefits me. As a walker, that benefits me. As someone who doesn't have a car or doesn't have space to park a car where I live, that benefits me. As someone who likes urban gardens, that benefits me. So that's where this social science and the planning and the participatory approach has really been lacking. What's very nice and very interesting is how systems learn from mistakes. So that, as many of you probably know, Transantiago had a very disastrous implementation, and it almost brought down the government in 2007. And as a result of that, it catalyzed this incredible search for how do we remedy this, and this incredible recognition that, hey, we really do need to literally and figuratively get people on board with this. How can we do it? And so now there is a really significant opportunity to move ahead on this year. So I'll go on to the next question. And Angela has also lived in in Lima. Any other questions or anything I can help with? Hello, Golam from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Great. I don't see a question. Okay. And from Nilanjana Devakshi, how do you think political will can be made favorable since that is the primary actor? Well, I would say that these kinds of blends of citizen mobilization, but organized citizens, because these are complicated issues. These are difficult to understand. There's a learning curve. They're not impossible. Ordinary people can understand this, but there is a learning curve. So participatory processes that build knowledge and build citizen organizations capable of accumulating knowledge, accumulating credibility, and effectively pressuring the political system at every scale is crucial. Without that, it's almost a peddling movement. You need political leadership and citizens pushing. Political leadership, citizens pushing, because there's that turnover every 3 or 4 years, depending on your political system. And when that turnover happens, unless citizens keep saying, this is important, just because that other government's gone doesn't mean we want to forget about this. That's very evident in the Netherlands and their progress. It took them 30 years. They didn't do it from one day to the next. And the way they did it was by building very powerful local, regional, and national citizen organizations. And also, interestingly, that boundary between being a citizen expert and being a technical effort is very permeable. So you see a lot of cases where citizen leaders became planners, planners became citizen leaders, etc. So a lot of exchange between those two words. Can I give an example of a disastrous mistake? Well, I think the way Transantiago was implemented in 2005, 2007 was pretty clearly disastrous. I'm not saying that everything was wrong, but we can look back on it now and we can say, okay, what was good about it was that they really did attempt a systemic change. It wasn't just one trunk road or a couple of trunk roads. It was the whole city that was impacted. But what that did was it really escalated the risk. And the planners at the time did not take a lot of measures to minimize the risk. So probably the most disastrous mistake of all was that from 2001 on, the government developed a plan for sustainable urban transport in Santiago. And there was citizen organizations, Living City, and others were participating in that plan and were demanding more participation in the development of Transantiago. And all of a sudden, as things accelerated, the people, we were being told, citizens in Living City and others who were participating were being told, there isn't time to participate. We can't bring any other people into this. But you're going to love it. You're going to love it. You're going to love it. And I remember participating in some debates at a transport congress just before the implementation, and we were looking at all the changes or all the wins with the implementation of the new system were technical wins. They were very good ones, but they were technical wins. And all the costs for those technical wins, better articulated system, routes that connected with other routes, that connected with other routes, supposedly better buses, etc. But all those came at a high cost for the users of the system. So the bigger buses came with fewer seats. Well, people were used to getting on the bus at 7 in the morning and riding for an hour or two and sleeping. And there were no seats for them to do that anymore, or there were very few. So it became very uncomfortable. Having to transfer over and over and over again when you were used to just one long continuous ride was not the best solution. And the new comforts that were promised, air conditioning, automatic transmissions, faster trips, they really didn't come together for a long time. So the upshot of that was that to this day, Transantiago, despite the fact there's been huge improvements in it, it's still considered the epitome of a bad policy. And so turning it around now, which is what we are starting to work on, is a major challenge. It would have been nice to avoid some of those kinds of mistakes, at least the foreseeable ones. You always make mistakes when you innovate, always. But you want to at least avoid the really obvious mistakes. And in this case, we had, I think, a very arrogant set of planners and some very strong economic criteria. So a lot of the investment that should have gone into the system didn't. Another example in the infrastructure was that they expropriated and built segregated ways where the land was cheapest, not where the congestion and the traffic was the highest. So those kinds of things would be, I would say, my idea of a pretty disastrous mistake. Do we have another question? Okay, my question is, government is interested in BRT, MRT, and there's ongoing progress. But the last few years, cycling's become very popular with individuals. But government's not very interested in that because they won't necessarily benefit. Okay, this is a great question. And this is something that we started working on last year and have already started to have some really interesting results. Because one of the really problematic things with BRT and buses generally is, of course, the last mile and the first mile, or that is the trip to get there and the trip to get where you're going. So cycling is really important for that. Not just individual cycling, but bike share, which has become just taken off worldwide. And there are huge systems in China and very significant systems in many developed and some developing cities as well. Cycling is also cycle taxis, it's two-wheelers, it's three-wheelers. It's a lot more than just someone getting on a bike and going for a ride. So what we've started to say is that we need to solve this problem of Transantiago door to door. And walking is part of the solution. Creating better walking conditions is definitely important. Having bathrooms at key bus stops and intermodal transport nodes, really important. There are no bathrooms in public spaces in Chile. That's kind of minimum for public transport users, especially as the population ages and we also have children and so on. So that's one issue. But then the other issue is cycling as a way of making public transport a much friendlier, easier to use, more flexible transport mode. And what this may also mean down the road for transport planning is that some feeder routes would be better served by a range of cycling possibilities than they are now served by buses. That's very context dependent. But certainly, if I take the subway to a major center like Plaza Italia in downtown Santiago, and I'm with my 3 kids and grandkids and all that, and parcels, and it's not very far. It's a 10-minute walk to get to my place, but I have all this stuff I'm carrying. So a cycle taxi would be very appropriate, much more appropriate than a motorized taxi for that short distance. So those are the kinds of intermodal considerations we're starting to talk about. And that is making people sit up and take notice and start to think, oh, it's not just cyclists over there and bus riders over here, but rather we all fit together rather neatly in a sustainable transport solution. Okay, well, we're at our limit, I think, for time.
Maybe we have time for one question.
Okay, is there one last question? I don't see any more. Here. Aha. Okay, I'm looking at the wrong one. How to change the system. I thought that was what my presentation was about. In a nutshell, bring people together, all kinds of different people, key people, so, from the citizen sphere, from the private sphere, from the public sphere, empower them, so give them the resources they need to act effectively, and create consensus building processes that mean people buy into the change. I don't really believe in models for innovation that impose it on people, not unless you're in a war or a total disaster situation. Okay, and we have someone from Stockholm whose public transport is pretty good. So BRT, instead of just what we already have, is like fighting for a special type of complex bikes. Will people do that? Well, you're the best judge of that, Carl. But what I would say is that one of the great beauties of bus rapid transit as cities grow and change, well, there's a couple actually. One is that subways, which were the solution of the 1900s, late 1800s, 1900s, and so on, they put people underground. And personally, I think people who use sustainable transport should be rewarded with light and fresh air and beautiful views and the possibility to interact with their city. So while metro and underground systems are great, and we should certainly make the most of them, I don't think they should be the public transport system that articulates our city. And the second thing is that also underground systems involve it's like the difference between going for a nice walk and going mountain climbing. You have to go up and down so many staircases and make so many complex connections, and they get more and more complex as the city builds up and it gets more and more complicated and so on, that actually thinking about bike, metro, or underground system integration is pretty difficult. Now, I know, I haven't been in Stockholm, but I know Denmark and the Netherlands do this extremely well. But for many cities, the price considerations, the level of investment involved in a bus system versus an underground system are really relevant. And the kind of flexibility and intermodality and rewards for sustainable travel, etc., that are inherent in bus and bus rapid transit is really important. That said, what I think is if your public transport is pretty good, it probably has a pretty high priority on your roads, because in most places, public transport is pretty bad, even though it moves the majority of people. And it's pretty bad because it has to compete with people in cars. So you have very small numbers of people in cars choking the roads so that huge numbers of people in public transport can't get where they want to go. And in that case, what BRT does, and I think should do more and more based on the research that I've been talking about here, is it's saying we need bus rapid transport as the main articulator of our, the bus rapid transport, yes, and bike integration to articulate our streets. So whereas today most of our streets are built automatically for cars, what we want is to start thinking about building a network of streets for bikes and buses, bikes for distances of 1 to 10 kilometers and buses for 2 kilometers and on up, because many of us live in very large cities. And BRT is a really excellent human technological combination for starting to articulate this new kind of city with this new kind of sustainable, socially just, inclusive transport system. Wow, so more questions are coming in, but we are a bit over. Is that all right?
Yeah, maybe we can answer the question by email.
Okay, let me just take a... Do you believe that adding urban planning to lower levels of education? Yes, I think it's absolutely essential. We did a program when I was working with Living City, the citizens planning group. We did a program with grade 4 students on mapping the city, mapping their neighborhood, mapping the city they would like to live in. and they were extremely articulate. They had very interesting, very creative ideas, very interesting ideas on balance and so on. And gee, aren't cities for children too? Don't we want our children to be safe in our cities? Aren't they kind of a high priority for human populations? So definitely include planning in education. Okay, and this one is the one I already answered. 50% in Stockholm is bus. Yay, hooray, very good. Okay, so on that note, that happy note, we can, I think, close this webinar. Thanks very much to all of you for participating and listening and asking questions, and I hope thinking about this. If you have any questions, my email is on the screen, and I would greatly enjoy hearing from you and learning a bit more about how useful this was for you, or what questions or observations or reflections you have from your city and your workspace. Thank you very much.